We are recreating an experiment the German psychologist Max Meyer first did in 1903. You've now heard the same terrible piece of music 3 times. You should have hated it the first time you heard it, but according to the results of the original experiment, you should have begun experiencing a little bit of pleasure the second time, and the degree of pleasure should have gone further the third time. In psychology, this phenomenon, the phenomenon of first hating something but then coming to like it through repetition, is known as the exposure effect. Can we say a piece of music is inherently bad? Or are all such judgments purely subjective? Historically, this question has been addressed in terms of beauty. One of the big questions within the philosophical field of aesthetics is, can something be inherently beautiful? The classical philosophers believed in objective beauty. They believed a thing will be beautiful if the parts are organised to form a coherent whole and according to certain values regarding proportion, harmony, and symmetry. An example of an appealing proportion is the ratio found in the golden section, which is a point we're going to reach later in this lecture. The inference is that if you make something that adheres to these values, then beauty will be reliably achieved. But the notion of objective beauty became discredited during the 18th century. The philosopher Edmund Burke formulated the following example to make the point. A swan has a very long neck. A medium-sized body and a tiny tail. Burke asks, is this a beautiful proportion? It must be, because everyone thinks that swans are beautiful. But this is confusing, as everyone also thinks that peacocks are beautiful. And peacocks have got a pretty short neck, an average-sized body, and a tail that's longer than the neck and body combined. Swan. Peacock. Swan. Peacock. Swan and peacock. Does that simply mean that there is no objective basis to our judgments? We'll return to that question later, but now let's go back to the music that you heard at the beginning. I composed that piece especially for this lecture. I tried to write a piece that had no inherently positive attributes. If I was successful, you should have experienced no pleasure the first time you heard it, but equally, according to the exposure effect, you should have begun experiencing a little pleasure when you heard the piece a second time, and that amount of pleasure should have increased with each repetition. But an interesting aspect of Max Meyer's experiment is that it raises the question, what constitutes bad music? I found it harder than I expected to compose a bad piece, a piece that would give you, the audience, no feelings of pleasure. I began with the following proposition. Music is inherently bad when it has no order. I set about composing music on my computer by assembling unrelated musical ideas in a random way. I wrote a bunch of pieces and I played them to friends to get some feedback. They told me the pieces were not that bad. They told me that they did perceive a sense of order and even a sense of cause and effect. I suppose the explanation is that our brains are wired up to look for cause and effect even when it's not there. Here's one of the pieces that I composed but decided not to use. In that piece, I also tried to compose musical ideas that lacked definition and identity, that lacked noteworthy or memorable features. I also tried to make it unfocused and lacking in purpose. But I decided not to use that piece because I became worried that the piece might in fact have a very strong sense of focus and meaning in expressing the state of confusion. After all, how can we tell the difference between a piece that is simply confused from a piece that has the aesthetic aim to express the state of confusion? As I listened to my various bad pieces that I'd written over and over again, I was also becoming increasingly fond of them. I realised that as the composer, I was not immune to the exposure effect. I could not put myself back in the shoes of someone hearing these pieces for the first time. So in the end, the one that I chose for the start of this lecture seemed to me the one that was just most clearly simply bad. I think it's bad by virtue of the fact that one can imagine that with some adjustments that it could sound good. In the end, the piece I chose is not bad because of its lack of order, or memorable feature, or its lack of focus. It's just bad because it's incompetent. Another reason a piece of music might be inherently bad is because it's overly repetitive. In the field of psychological aesthetics, there is a concept called processing fluency, which refers to the ease with which information is processed. The ability to process information fluently gives us pleasure. In turn, a highly repetitive work produces a positive reaction. But this pleasure, of course, is short-lived, as once the listener understands what's going on, boredom will set in and a negative reaction results. This state of diminished interest is called habituation. David Huron proposes that highly repetitive musical works will be experienced positively if that repetition is offset with a small degree of variation. The next piece has a large amount of repetition to engender the positive feelings that result from processing fluency, whilst there's also a small degree of variation to defer negative feelings that result from the onset of habituation. Another way that David Huron suggests that a composer can maintain listener interest with a minimum of compositional effort is through the occasional deployment of novelty. Within this highly repetitive context, a novel musical idea is now introduced at strategic moments to take care that you will not succumb to habituation. Let's now return to a state of pure repetition. David Huron proposes that after a number of repetitions, listeners will habituate, and in turn responsiveness and pleasure will decline. On the face of it, that seems totally reasonable. But now let's consider this statement. Excessive repetition is an invitation to listen in. A purely repetitive work may lead listeners to a state of disinterestedness, but we can also imagine a listener who became highly interested in the way that the musical idea resonates in the space, highly interested in the small details in the musical idea that they missed the first 10 times, including the incidental sounds, such as the sound of the guitarist's hand moving along the instrument's neck. This person might also tune into non-sonic aspects, such as studying the way that the musicians communicate with one another. Such a listener might note that in this context of extreme repetition, one element that sometimes does change is the facial expressions of the performers. A reflective person might also pause to appreciate the physical feat of playing such vigorous music over and over again. One of the notes in that melody might have caused a degree of irritation. The unexpected note choice is likely to have been surprising. The moment's not really bad, it's more puzzling. And although puzzling moments are often experienced negatively, they've also got a positive potential since they attract our attention and interest. If the melody came back later in the piece, this puzzling deviation could be resolved, which would in turn give us pleasure. If the piece did not resolve a moment of deviance, if it simply continued without any further reference to that deviance, then I think we could make a strong argument that the piece was bad, since this transgressive note was meaningless beyond simply being a moment of deviance. This moment might be so puzzling we might even conclude that the performers had made a mistake. That example also had a moment of deviance. The deviant moment was much weirder. It was what we might call stylistic transgression. So far, we've considered the matter of bad music primarily from a psychological perspective. We've explored whether an understanding of our mental processes can provide an objective basis for our judgments. But the factors that shape our mental processes are much broader than we've acknowledged. We'll now look at why a piece of music might produce different reactions and what role context plays in our judgments. Imagine a continuation of that piece that attempted to reconcile this stylistic transgression. Attempting to make sense of that heavy metal confusion really would be an ambitious piece. If the piece pulled it off, that really would be something. But even if it did in some sense pull it off, there are still lots of people who wouldn't like it, no matter how good and successful it was. To explore this, let's consider three hypothetical individuals.
My hypothetical name is Julia. I quite like the melody in that piece. But for me, the inclusion of heavy metal was an immediate turn-off. I think heavy metal is too loud, too aggressive, and I associate it with satanic worship. I feel negatively about satanic worship.
My hypothetical name is Roger. I have made a firm and exclusive commitment to blues music. I believe blues is the highest form of music because it is improvised, it is expressive, and it deals with personal woes in a harsh world. The idea of an instrumental piece that tries to marry two different styles together just sounds bad. It has no lyrics, and it just sounds like an academic exercise. I think music should be about the expression of feelings.
Most of Roger's friends are also blues enthusiasts, and their love of blues music is an important part of their social identity, pride, and self-esteem. According to the theory of Henry Tushfell, social identity theory, in order to enhance our sense of self-worth, we give more status to the group we belong, which also involves discriminating against other groups. We divide the world into us and them through a process of social, or in this case, aesthetic categorization. We all do it.
My hypothetical name is Catherine. I don't like the idea of that piece because I believe in stylistic purity. I will concede that the whole idea of mixing styles was historically important during the heyday of postmodernism, but ultimately it was a dead end. Doing it now is just dated.
The exposure effect is a theory that tries to explain why we may positively revise our opinion about a musical piece. Huron believes that exposure alone does not provide the full explanation. He argues that we like music when it gives us pleasure, and that being able to predict what will happen next in a musical piece gives us pleasure. When we are not able to predict what happens next, we don't experience pleasure, and in turn we don't like the piece. But if we hear a piece a number of times, we can learn to predict what will happen next, which gives us pleasure, and in turn leads us to change our opinion. To back up his argument, Huron proposed a thought experiment, which I realised for this lecture. What you've just heard consisted of 5 short sound events. A, B, C, D, and E. Those elements were randomly organised, but with 2 stipulations. The first was that A occurred far more frequently than the other sound events. The second stipulation was that every time D appeared, it was followed by E. So the order of the sound events was completely random, aside from this one condition, that every time D appeared, it led to E. Huron's argument is that if the degree of exposure was the most important factor in listener pleasure, then sound event A should have given you the most pleasure, as that was the element that you were most exposed to. You heard A 19 times, whereas none of the others appeared more than 8 times. But Huron thinks that you would not have received the most pleasure from A, but rather from E, as that was the only element that you could learn to anticipate. You could learn to successfully predict that every time you heard D, that E would come next. And the point is that this ability to successfully predict produces pleasure. It's a great experiment, but surely other factors are also at play. Perhaps you like C the best, because you thought C sounded cool, or perhaps something in it reminded you of the first date you had with your current partner in a Thai restaurant. So we're repeating the experiment again now, with A, B, C, D and E, each just now represented by a single pitch. The same rules apply. A is appearing the most often. You can hear it played by the violin. And whenever D appears on the synthesizer, it's always followed by E on the guitar. In this final part, we're now returning to the opening to create a rounded form. In his practical guide to music composition, Professor Alan Belkin suggests that a rounded form can convincingly conclude a piece through providing the listener with a sense of stability, relaxation, and closure. This textbook view of composition taps into the values of proportion, harmony, and symmetry from the classical philosophers that we considered earlier. In creating a symmetrical relationship with the opening, I'm hoping to create a tension between good and bad practice, as although the rounded form here might be good practice, the music's still bad. But in the end, can we really say that this music or any music is bad? That's the question we posed at the start of this lecture. And from everything we've considered, it seems we've got to conclude that evaluating music is a subjective act. And yet David Huron argues that musical pieces can be objectively bad. Taking the example of this opening music, Huron might argue, this music is objectively bad. Yes, you've come to like it, but that's simply because you've begun experiencing pleasure as you've become able to successfully predict what will happen next. That doesn't mean it's good. You're confused. This is a classic case of what psychologists call misattribution. What's going on here is that you're attributing the pleasure that you're receiving from the music to the music, when really the award for the pleasure should go to the mental circuit that's formed in your brain that's enabled you to make these successful predictions. That's a pretty amazing thought, but it's also troubling. For how can we distinguish between the pleasure that we get from good music and the misattributed pleasure that we get from bad music?